The handshake that waited 21 years. On the evening of October 12, 1973, millions of Americans settled into their living rooms expecting the same familiar comfort they had come to trust every night. Johnny Carson would crack a few jokes, Ed McMahon would laugh, the band would play, and America would go to bed smiling. That was the ritual. That was the promise of The Tonight Show. No one watching that night had any idea they were about to witness the most emotionally devastating moment in the show's history. One that would change how the nation remembered a forgotten war and a forgotten hero. When Clint Eastwood stepped out from behind the curtain, the applause was thunderous. He was at the peak of his fame, the face of toughness, the embodiment of quiet strength. As he approached Johnny Carson's desk, he extended his hand, expecting the traditional handshake that opened every interview. Johnny stood up, looked at Clint's hand, then into his eyes, and calmly said 3 words that shattered the moment. "Not this time." The audience fell silent. The band stopped playing mid-note. Clint Eastwood froze, his hand still extended, his famous squint tightening as confusion crossed his face. Johnny Carson had never refused a guest's handshake, not once in more than 3,000 episodes. And now, with 30 million Americans watching live, he had done the unthinkable. What followed was not entertainment. It was confession. It was memory. It was a promise finally kept. The telegram that changed everything. 6 hours earlier, Johnny Carson had been sitting alone in his office at NBC Studios in Burbank, California. The room was familiar, Emmy Awards on the shelf, a Karnak turban hanging from a coat hook, cigarette smoke curling lazily through the air. Johnny had spent years crafting an image, approachable, funny, safe. America trusted him because he never made them uncomfortable. Then his secretary entered, her voice quiet and tense, and placed a yellow Western Union telegram on his desk. It was marked in red ink, urgent, personal. The postmark read Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Johnny's hands began to shake before he even opened it. The first line stopped his breath. "Johnny, it's Dutch Morrison. I'm dying. Stage 4 lung cancer. VA hospital. Doctors say 2 weeks, maybe less." Johnny felt his cigarette slip from his fingers and burn into the desk, but he didn't notice. His eyes kept reading. "Clint Eastwood is booked on your show tomorrow. Before you shake his hand, America needs to know what happened in Korea. On Hill 418. I'm releasing you both from the promise. Tell them the truth. Tell them we existed. Tell them the forgotten soldiers mattered." Johnny sat back in his chair, staring at the wall. For 21 years, he had kept silent. The box that was never thrown away. Johnny stood and walked to his desk drawer, unlocking the bottom compartment with hands that trembled. Inside was a small metal box he had carried through every move, every success, every reinvention of his life. He hadn't opened it in years, but he had never once considered throwing it away. Inside lay a Purple Heart medal. Not his. There were dog tags stamped Morrison, William J. and a faded photograph taken in Korea, 3 young men in combat fatigue standing on a hillside, arms around each other, forcing smiles into a world that had already taken too much. Johnny was 26 in that photo. Clint was 21. Dutch Morrison was 28. Dutch had given Johnny the Purple Heart in a military hospital in 1952, pressing it into his hand with one simple request. "Hold this for me until I ask for it back." He never did. Instead, Dutch Morrison kept serving. 3 tours in Korea, 2 in Vietnam, 23 years total. No interviews. No recognition. No headlines. Just duty. The same message, 2 men. Johnny reached for the phone and asked to be connected to Clint Eastwood's agent. When Clint returned the call, there was no small talk. Clint had received the same telegram. The same release. The same request. The same weight lifted from his chest. In Carmel, California, Clint sat alone that night holding an old silver military compass, the kind issued during the Korean War. He turned it over in his hands again and again, remembering a night when the needle spun wildly as artillery shook the ground around him. Neither man slept. Both knew that the next night would change everything. The day of the show. Johnny arrived early at the studio on October 12th. He always did, but this time he locked his dressing room door and stayed inside. Ed McMahon knocked once, then twice. "You all right in there, Johnny?" "I'm fine," Johnny replied. "Just trust me tonight." Ed frowned. Johnny had never sounded like that before. Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood arrived 90 minutes early, a detail that didn't go unnoticed by the crew. In the green room, he sat alone, turning the silver compass in his hands. A stagehand glanced at it and noticed Clint's jaw was clenched, his eyes restless. At 5:15 p.m., Johnny walked past the green room. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged. Just a nod. Tonight, the silence would end. The show begins. Johnny's monologue was sharp, jokes about politics, gas prices, baseball. The audience laughed, but Ed noticed something was off. Johnny kept touching his jacket pocket. When the first guest finished, Johnny leaned toward the producer during the commercial break. When Clint comes out, don't cut to commercial. No matter what happens. The producer hesitated. Johnny's expression ended the conversation. Ed leaned closer. Johnny, you're sweating. In 4 minutes, Johnny said quietly, you're going to learn something about me I've never told anyone. The handshake that never see me at 6:02 p.m., Ed McMahon introduced Clint Eastwood. The applause erupted. The band played the good, the bad and the ugly theme. Clint walked out slowly, confidently, but his right hand stayed in his jacket pocket. When he reached Johnny's desk, he extended his left hand. Johnny stood. Looked at Clint's hand. Then into his eyes. Not this time, Clint. 3 seconds passed. Johnny reached into his jacket and pulled out the Purple Heart. This doesn't belong to me, he said. It belongs to Sergeant William Morrison, United States Army, Korean War. America leaned forward. Korea, 1951. Johnny began. In December 1951, he was a young Navy officer stationed offshore. Clint was a terrified Army private drafted a year earlier. They met by chance at a makeshift bar in Seoul during a brief leave, 2 small-town boys pretending not to be scared. Then Dutch Morrison walked in. 6'4". Farm boy from Nebraska. Calm eyes. Second tour already behind him. Dutch bought them drinks. Made them laugh. And then said something that stayed with them forever. War will take enough from you. Don't let it take your humanity. For 3 days, he became their anchor. Hill 418. On February 8, 1952, Chinese forces launched a surprise night assault on Hill 418. Hundreds of soldiers came over the ridge in darkness. Clint was pinned down in a supply depot with no cover. Johnny was trapped in a command bunker. Dutch's unit was ordered to fall back. Dutch disobeyed. He ran into open fire. He dragged Clint to safety. Took command of the bunker. Fought for 6 hours while wounded in the shoulder, leg, and abdomen. He saved 4 to 9 men. When medics arrived at dawn, Dutch looked at Johnny and Clint and said, "Promise me you'll make your lives count." They did. The promise of silence. Later, recovering in a hospital, Dutch made them promise something else. Never say his name. Never tell the story. Never let fame pull him out of the field. So they stayed silent. Johnny became America's voice. Clint became America's tough guy. And every success carried a secret. The call he never expected. Back in 1973, Johnny announced the creation of the Dutch Morrison Veterans Fund live on air. Then he did something unprecedented. He called Dutch's hospital room. When Dutch's weak voice came through the speakers, the studio broke. Grown men cried openly. "I didn't want to die forgotten," Dutch whispered. "You won't," Clint said. "We swear." The final days. Johnny and Clint flew to Iowa days later. They recorded Dutch's story, his childhood, his service, his sacrifices. Dutch admitted he watched every Tonight Show episode he could catch. Every Clint Eastwood film. "I was proud of you boys," he said. On October 24, 1973, Dutch Morrison died peacefully with both men at his side. The legacy. The funeral drew thousands. The fund raised millions. Johnny featured veterans monthly for the rest of his career. Clint made films honoring soldiers. Every year, on February 8, they called each other and said 2 words. We remembered. Why this story matters. This isn't just about Johnny Carson or Clint Eastwood. It's about the soldiers who never spoke. The heroes who asked to be forgotten. The promises kept in silence. Sometimes the greatest handshakes take 21 years. And sometimes, the world finally remembers a man who never asked to be known. Sergeant William Dutch Morrison. Now you know his name.